I cook steak for a dog while billionaire heirs eat cereal. Here's why. I'm 62 years old, and I've seen some things in my life. Served in the Marine Corps for 20 years. Saw action in places most Americans couldn't find on a map if their lives depended on it. I learned real quick that there are two types of people in this world. Those who understand what duty means, and those who wouldn't recognize honor if it bit them on their perfectly tan rear ends. This story is about both kinds. My name is Frank, and for the last 15 years, I worked as a groundskeeper and caretaker for a man named Richard Sterling. Not the kind of job you brag about at high school reunions, but it was honest work. Mr. Sterling was worth about $250 million, give or take. Made his fortune in tech back in the 90s. Got out before the bubble burst. Smart guy. But more importantly, he was a good man. You don't find many of those in his tax bracket. The thing about Mr. Sterling that most people didn't know was that he served too. Vietnam, Marine Corps, just like me. We never talked about it much, but we didn't have to. There's this look that combat vets share, this understanding that goes deeper than words. Some nights, I'd find him sitting on the back porch of his mansion, staring at nothing, and I'd sit down next to him with 2 glasses of bourbon. We'd sit there for an hour, maybe 2, barely saying a word. But we both knew what the other was thinking about. The things we'd seen, the things we'd done, the brothers we'd lost. That's a bond you can't fake. You can't buy it. You can't inherit it from your daddy's bank account. Mr. Sterling had 2 kids, Chad and Tiffany. I'll tell you right now, those 2 were living proof that money can't buy class, brains, or basic human decency. Chad was 35 and had never worked a real day in his life. Everything handed to him on a silver platter. The kind of guy who wore $2,000 sneakers and called himself an entrepreneur because he invested daddy's money in some crypto scheme. Tiffany was 32, and her full-time job was being an influencer. I'm not even sure what that means, but apparently taking pictures of yourself and posting them online qualifies as a career these days. They visited maybe twice a year, Christmas and Thanksgiving. And even then, it was clear they were just checking boxes, making sure they stayed in the will. They'd show up in their fancy cars, stay for a few hours, take some photos for social media, and disappear back to Los Angeles or New York or wherever people go when they have too much money and too little purpose. Mr. Sterling knew what they were. He wasn't stupid, but he was their father, and I guess that meant something to him, even if it didn't mean much to them. About 6 months ago, Mr. Sterling got sick. Cancer, the kind that moves fast and doesn't care how much money you have. He fought it the way he fought everything else in his life, with quiet dignity and 0 complaints. No dramatic scenes. No why me speeches. Just a man facing death the same way he faced life, with his boots on. I spent more time in that house during those last months than I had in all the previous years combined. Someone needed to be there. Someone who actually gave a damn. The hired nurses were professional, sure, but they didn't know him. They didn't understand that he liked his coffee black and strong enough to strip paint. They didn't know that he hated the sound of daytime television or that he liked to listen to old Johnny Cash records when the pain got bad. I knew, and there was Sergeant, Mr. Sterling's golden retriever, 12 years old, gray around the muzzle, moving a little slow these days but still loyal as they come. That dog never left Mr. Sterling's side. Not once. He'd lay his big gray head on the bed, those brown eyes watching his owner with the kind of devotion that makes you believe in something bigger than yourself. Mr. Sterling once told me something I'll never forget. He said, dogs know things we don't. They can sense character. They know who's genuine and who's fake. They can smell fear and greed and dishonesty from a mile away, and they're never wrong. Sergeant loved Mr. Sterling, tolerated me, and absolutely could not stand Chad and Tiffany. Smart dog. The last few weeks were the hardest. Mr. Sterling was down to maybe 120 pounds. His voice was barely a whisper, but his mind was sharp right up to the end. That's the cruel thing about some diseases. They take your body but leave your mind intact, forcing you to watch yourself fade away in high definition. It was a Tuesday afternoon when he called me into his bedroom. The room smelled like medicine and old books, and that particular scent that fills a house when death is waiting in the hallway. Not unpleasant exactly, just final. Sergeant was lying on the floor next to the bed, and he lifted his head when I walked in, giving me that look that said he knew what was coming. I sat down in the chair next to the bed, Mr. Sterling's hand, which once signed checks that could change markets, could barely lift off the blanket. His voice was so quiet I had to lean in close to hear him. He told me he appreciated everything I'd done over the years. Not just the work, but the company, the friendship. He said I was the closest thing to a brother he'd had since Vietnam. Coming from him, that meant more than any paycheck ever could. Then he reached under his pillow and pulled out something I hadn't seen in decades. A military dog tag, worn smooth from years of handling. The engraved letters and numbers barely visible. He pressed it into my palm, and the metal felt cold against my skin. He told me it was the registration number of his last battalion. His voice got even quieter, and I had to lean in so close I could feel his breath. He said his kids would never understand what it meant, but he knew I would, because I understood what an order meant, what duty meant. Then he looked at Sergeant, and his eyes, clouded with pain medication and approaching death, suddenly focused with crystal clarity. He said I needed to take care of Sergeant. He made me promise. He said not to let those vultures hurt his dog. That was the exact word he used. Vultures. I didn't need to ask who he meant. I closed my fist around that dog tag and nodded. I didn't say anything because my throat was too tight to trust my voice. But he understood. This wasn't my boss giving instructions to an employee. This was one Marine entrusting a mission to another. This was a deathbed order, and in the Corps, you don't refuse those. Not ever. He died 3 hours later. Quietly. Sergeant knew before any of us did. The dog lifted his head and let out this low, mournful sound that wasn't quite a howl, but wasn't a whimper either. It was grief in its purest form. I sat with Mr. Sterling's body until the funeral home people arrived. Somebody needed to. It felt wrong to just leave him there alone with strangers. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday. I figured I'd have a few days to process everything, to get Sergeant settled, to figure out what came next for both of us. Mr. Sterling had left me a small sum in his will, enough to maybe rent a decent place and get back on my feet, and I'd been told I could stay in the groundskeeper's cottage until after the funeral. I should have known better. Death has a way of bringing out the absolute worst in people. And in Chad and Tiffany, there wasn't much good to begin with. They showed up the very next morning. I heard the car before I saw it. A Lamborghini. Bright yellow. The kind of color that screams, "Look at me. I'm compensating for something." The engine roared up the driveway like it was announcing the arrival of royalty. Chad climbed out first. Sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Hairstyle with so much product it could survive a hurricane. Designer jeans that looked pre-ripped, which always struck me as the stupidest thing in the world. Why pay extra for pants that are already damaged? He had this swagger, this confidence that came from never being told no in his entire life. Tiffany emerged from the passenger side like she was stepping onto a red carpet. Everything about her was calculated. The oversized designer purse. The athleisure outfit that cost more than some people's cars. The face that had clearly seen more Botox than a Hollywood award show. She had her phone out before her feet hit the gravel, already filming herself. I watched from the cottage window as she posed in front of the main house, making that pouty face people make for social media, trying to squeeze out a tear that wouldn't come naturally. She was performing grief for an audience of strangers, while her father's body was barely cold. You look at people like that, and you gotta wonder, is it all an act? Are they just pretending to be that shallow for attention? Or are they really that empty inside? Watching those two, I had my answer. It wasn't an act. They walked past me like I was invisible. I was standing right there on the front path, and they looked through me like I was part of the landscaping. Just another fixture of the estate they'd just inherited. I took a breath and decided to try being decent. Force of habit, I guess. I walked up to them and offered my condolences. Told them their father was a great man and that I was sorry for their loss. Simple words. Respectful. Tiffany cut me off with a wave of her hand. Her nails were so long and decorated, I couldn't figure out how she did basic human tasks like typing or opening doors. She looked at me like I just interrupted something important, even though she was literally just standing there. She said something about how her father never took off his gold watch, the one his father gave him, family heirloom. Then she asked where it was, and her tone made it real clear she wasn't just asking. She was accusing. She said people like me always know the value of things that don't belong to us. Let me tell you something about being accused of theft when you've spent your whole life being honest. It hits different than a punch to the face. At least with a punch, you can defend yourself. With an accusation like that, there's nothing you can say that won't make you sound guilty. I stood there, speechless, feeling the blood drain from my face and then rush back hot and angry. Before I could say anything, Chad pulled out his wallet. He made a big show of it, like he was doing me this huge favor. He fished out a crumpled $100 bill, and instead of handing it to me, he tucked it into the front pocket of my work shirt, patting it twice like you'd tip a bellhop. Called me old man, said it was for taking out the trash and cleaning toilets. Then he told me to pack my stuff. Said I had 1 hour. 1 hour to gather 15 years of my life and get off the property. He told me not to make him call the police. The police? Like I was some kind of criminal. I felt my hands curl into fists. Knuckles went white. 40 years ago, I would have shown that punk what a Marine does when disrespected. But I'm 62 now, not 22. And more importantly, I've learned that some battles aren't worth fighting. Not because you can't win, but because winning would require you to stoop to their level. My jaw was clenched so tight, I thought my teeth might crack. Every muscle in my body was coiled like a spring, but I forced myself to relax my hands, to unclench my jaw, to breathe. They escorted me back to the cottage like I was being perp-walked, like I was some kind of threat. Sergeant followed me, confused, looking back at the main house where his owner had been, trying to understand why we were leaving. I packed fast. Didn't have much anyway. Clothes, books, a few photos, the essentials of a simple life. The whole time, Chad stood in the doorway, arms crossed, checking his phone every 30 seconds like this was boring him, making sure I didn't steal the silverware or something. When I was done, I picked up my duffel bag and walked toward the front gate. Sergeant followed me, staying close to my leg. That dog knew something was wrong. Dogs always know. I was almost at the gate when I heard Tiffany's voice behind me. Loud, intentionally loud. She was on her phone, but I knew she wanted me to hear. She was talking about Sergeant, about how they needed to do something about the dog. She said he was old and drooled everywhere, and it would be more humane to just put him down. She actually used the word humane like she knew what that meant. I stopped walking. The dog tag in my pocket suddenly felt like it was burning through the fabric, straight into my soul. This wasn't about being fired anymore. This was about them threatening to destroy something good and loyal just because they could. I turned and looked back at that mansion, at those two spoiled excuses for human beings, laughing as they divvied up a dead man's life. They thought this was over. They thought they'd won. But Mr. Sterling gave me a mission, and in the Corps, you don't abandon a mission, ever. I squeezed that dog tag until the edges dug into my palm, turned my back on them, and walked through those gates with my head held high. Sergeant stayed close to my leg, his head low, but his steps steady. Let them laugh. Let them celebrate their inheritance. They had no idea. The war had just begun. 5 days passed. 5 days of living in a motel that smelled like cigarettes and broken dreams. The kind of place where you pay by the week and nobody asks questions. Sergeant stayed with me, curled up on the thin carpet next to my bed. I'd sneak him in and out when the manager wasn't looking. That dog deserved better than this, but he never complained. Just stayed close, loyal to the end. I'd made my peace with it, honestly. I figured I'd find another job, maybe security work, maybe groundskeeping at a golf course. Something. I'm 62, not dead. I still had my Marine pension. Small as it was, we'd get by. Sergeant and I, we'd survive. That's what I kept telling myself. Then my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. These days, unknown numbers usually meant someone trying to sell you something or scam you out of what little you had left. But something made me pick up. It was a woman's voice. Professional. Polite. She identified herself as a paralegal from Whitmore, Davis & Associates, Mr. Sterling's law firm. She said they were conducting a formal reading of the will and that my presence was requested. Required, actually. I told her there must be some mistake. I was just the groundskeeper. Why would I need to be there? She said she couldn't discuss the details over the phone, but that Mr. Sterling had specifically included my name in the will documentation. The reading was scheduled for 2 o'clock that Thursday. The address was downtown, one of those glass and steel buildings where the rent on a single office probably costs more than most people make a year. I hung up and stared at Sargent. He tilted his head at me, the way dogs do when they're trying to understand human nonsense. I figure it was probably a formality. Maybe Mr. Sterling left me a few $1,000s. A thank you for the years of service. It would help. God knows I could use it. But I wasn't expecting anything. That wasn't why I'd stayed with him all those years. Thursday came. I put on my one good suit. Navy blue. A little tight around the middle these days, but still presentable. I'd bought it for my daughter's wedding 10 years ago. Hadn't worn it since. I polished my shoes until they actually shined. Old Marine habits die hard. Even when your life is falling apart, you show up looking squared away. The law office was exactly what I expected. All marble floors and expensive artwork and furniture that cost more than a car. The kind of place designed to make you feel small. Make you remember your place in the world. The receptionist directed me to a conference room on the 14th floor. When I walked in, they were already there. Chad and Tiffany, sitting at a long mahogany table that probably cost more than my yearly salary. They looked at me the way you'd look at a cockroach that somehow crawled onto your wedding cake. Disgust mixed with confusion mixed with that special kind of contempt rich people reserve for those they consider beneath them. Chad's mouth actually fell open. He looked at the lawyer, a thin man in his 60s named Davis, with wire-rimmed glasses and eyes that seen everything twice. Chad's voice had this edge to it, like he was talking to someone who made a serious mistake and was about to get fired for it. He wanted to know what I was doing there. Use a different word than that, actually, but I'll keep this family-friendly. The tone made it clear. I was an insect that had wandered into a place it didn't belong. Mr. Davis adjusted his glasses with one finger. Slow, deliberate. He'd probably practiced that move 1,000 times in court. He said I was there at the specific and explicit request of their father. His voice was dry as old paper, but there was something else underneath it. Something that might have been satisfaction. Tiffany made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a snort. She said something about how this was ridiculous, that they didn't have time for this, that she had a brand deal to finalize. A brand deal. Her father was dead less than a week, and she was worried about selling protein powder or face cream or whatever nonsense influencers push these days. Mr. Davis gestured to an empty chair. I sat down. The leather was so soft it probably cost more than my motel room, more than a month of motel rooms. I kept my hands folded in my lap and my back straight. Old habits. Davis opened a leather folder. Began to read. The will was straightforward at first. Very formal language. Lots of legal terms that basically boiled down to this. Everything goes to the children. The estate valued at approximately $250 million. The house. The investment portfolio. The stock holdings. The art collection. All of it to be divided equally between Chad Sterling and Tiffany Sterling. I watched their faces as Davis read through it. They were trying to look somber, trying to pretend this was a sad moment, but you could see it in their eyes. The calculations. The mental spending sprees. Chad was probably already picking out which supercar to buy. Tiffany was probably planning her next vacation, somewhere expensive and photogenic. I just sat there, listening. This wasn't about me. This was about saying goodbye to a good man in the only way left to me, by being present, by bearing witness. Davis continued through the document. Real estate holdings in 3 states. Stocks, bonds, a private art collection worth 8 figures by itself. It went on and on. A lifetime of wealth accumulated by a man who never really cared about money, who had been just as happy in a cabin in the woods with his dog and his books. 20 minutes in, I started to wonder why I was really there. Maybe there was a small bequest at the end. A line item. $5,000 to the groundskeeper. Thank you for your service. I would have been grateful for it, but I didn't need it. Not really. I'd made my peace with walking away with nothing but my dignity and a dog that wasn't even mine. Then Davis paused, took a slow sip of water from a crystal glass, set it down with a soft click against the mahogany. He looked at me, direct eye contact. For the first time since I'd walked in, he looked at me like I was actually supposed to be there. He said there was an additional provision, a mandatory and irrevocable trust. His voice changed slightly when he said that word. Irrevocable, like he was loading a round into a chamber. I saw Chad and Tiffany stiffen, just slightly, the way people do when they hear something unexpected in a conversation they thought they controlled. Davis explained that Mr. Sterling had established a trust under Wyoming state law. For those who don't know, Wyoming is where rich people set up trusts when they want them to be bulletproof. Harder to challenge than Fort Knox. Harder to break than a Marine's oath. The trust was called the Sergeant Sterling Trust, named after the dog. Davis said the registration number for this trust was engraved on a military dog tag, the dog tag currently in my possession. My hand went to my pocket automatically. I'd been carrying it every day since Mr. Sterling pressed it into my palm. I pulled it out. The metal caught the light from the office windows, those tall windows that looked out over the city like the office was surveying its kingdom. I looked at the engraved numbers, really looked at them for the first time. Serial numbers I'd assumed were from Mr. Sterling's military service. But they weren't. They were a trust registration number, a key, a weapon disguised as a memorial. In that moment, I understood. Mr. Sterling hadn't just asked me to take care of his dog. He'd handed me the keys to the kingdom. The worn metal in my hand, which had felt cold just moments before, now seemed to pulse with a faint warmth. He'd done it right under their noses. Davis continued reading, and I swear there was the tiniest hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. The kind of smile a chess master gets when they're about to announce checkmate. The terms were specific, very specific. First, full and sole guardianship of the dog known as Sergeant was granted to me, Frank Morrison. No one else could make decisions about the dog's care, health, or well-being. That authority was mine alone. Second, I was granted lifetime residency in the main guest house of the state, not the groundskeeper's cottage. The guest house, the one with 4 bedrooms and a view of the gardens. I'd cleaned the house 100 times but never imagined living in it. Full access to the grounds was included. The pool, the gardens, everything. Third, I would receive an annual salary of $350,000 for my services as Sergeant's guardian, paid monthly, adjusted for inflation, for life. I heard Tiffany make a choking sound, like she just swallowed something the wrong way. Chad's face had gone from tan to an odd grayish color, the color of old meat. But Davis wasn't done, not even close. Fourth, a separate fund of $5 million was established exclusively for Sergeant's care and maintenance. Davis actually read out the specifics, and I had to stop myself from laughing. Daily meals of filet mignon and wild-caught salmon. Access to the country's top veterinary specialists. Weekly hydrotherapy sessions at a certified facility. And my personal favorite, transportation in Mr. Sterling's Rolls-Royce with a designated driver for any trips required for the dog's well-being or happiness. My dog, who I'd been sneaking into a $30 a night motel, was now officially richer than 99% of Americans. Chad stood up, started to say something. Davis held up one finger. Didn't even look at him. Just held up that finger like a teacher silencing a student. Chad sat back down. Davis said there was one more provision, the most important one. He took off his glasses, cleaned them with a small cloth, and put them back on, taking his time, drawing it out. This man had been waiting to read this part. Any sale, transfer, or substantial modification of the primary estate assets required written, notarized consent from the dog's guardian. That meant the house, the land, the art collection, the vintage car collection. All of it. They couldn't sell it, couldn't leverage it, couldn't touch it without my signature. I had veto power over their entire inheritance. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that follows a bomb dropping. You could hear the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic 14 floors below, the blood pounding in your ears. Tiffany found her voice first, demanded to know if this was legal, if this could be real. Her voice had gone up about an octave. All that vocal training for her YouTube videos, gone in an instant. Davis looked at her with the expression of a man who'd been practicing law for 40 years and had heard every stupid question twice. He explained that Wyoming trust law was specifically designed to protect the grantor's wishes, that Mr. Sterling had used every legal tool available, that the trust had been reviewed by 3 separate law firms, that challenging it would cost millions in legal fees with virtually no chance of success. He added, in a tone that suggested he was enjoying this more than he probably should, that there was one final clause, a trigger, he called it, if the trust terms were violated, or if any harm came to either the dog or its guardian, or if there was any attempt at coercion, 95% of the entire estate would immediately transfer to the Marine Corps Veterans Relief Fund. $237 million. Gone. To charity. Just like that. The only way they kept their inheritance was by keeping me happy and keeping Sergeant healthy. I looked at Chad, watched his face go through about 5 different emotions in 10 seconds. Shock, disbelief, rage, calculation, and finally, something like the face you make when you realize you just stepped in something you can't wipe off your shoe. His tan had completely disappeared. He looked like a ghost. His lips were pressed into this thin white line, and his hands were gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had gone white. You could actually see him shaking, just slightly. That little tremor people get when they're trying not to explode. Tiffany looked worse. Her face, that perfectly sculpted, Botoxed, filtered face that she showed to millions of followers, was doing something I'd never seen before. It was falling apart. Her eyes had gone wide, showing white all around. Her mouth kept opening and closing, but no sound came out. She looked exactly like a fish that had been pulled out of water and thrown on a dock, gasping, desperate, unable to process what was happening. She was trying to cry, I think, trying to summon tears. But nothing came, just this dry, gasping sound. Davis closed the folder, asked if there were any questions. His tone suggested he really hoped there were, because he was ready with answers that would only make this worse for them. Nobody said anything. I sat there, holding that dog tag, and something shifted in my chest. Not triumph, not joy, not revenge. Something quieter than that. Something that felt like justice finally showing up after being late for 62 years. Mr. Sterling had known. He'd known exactly what his kids were, what they'd become, and he'd known exactly what they'd do the moment he was gone. So he'd built a trap, a beautiful, legal, completely airtight trap, and he'd baited it with everything they wanted most. Then he'd handed me the trigger. Chad made one last attempt. Asked Davis if there was any way to contest this, any loophole, any strategy. His voice had lost all its confidence, all its swagger. He sounded like a little boy who just found out Santa wasn't real, and the tooth fairy was his mom. Davis smiled, actually smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a lawyer who just executed his client's final wish perfectly. He said Mr. Sterling had been very specific in his instructions, that he'd anticipated every possible challenge, that he'd spent the last year of his life making this bulletproof, that he'd told Davis directly, in a meeting 6 months before his death, that his greatest fear was his children hurting his dog out of spite or stupidity. So he'd made it impossible. Tiffany let out this sound, part sob, part scream, part something I don't have a word for. She pushed back from the table, her chair making an ugly scraping sound against the marble floor. She looked at me like I was personally responsible for this, like I'd somehow orchestrated it. Her mascara had started to run, just a little, enough to ruin that perfect face. She said I'd done this somehow, that I'd manipulated her father, that I'd taken advantage of a sick old man. Her voice was shaking. getting louder. All that influencer charm gone, replaced by raw desperation. I didn't say anything, just looked at her. Sometimes silence is the best response. Davis suggested they might want to take some time to process this information, that he'd be available to answer questions once they consulted with their own attorneys, that copies of all documentation would be provided. He stood up, extended his hand to me, shook it firmly, told me his office would be in touch regarding the logistics, bank accounts, access to the property, all the details. I thanked him. My voice sounded strange in that expensive room, too rough, too real, like bringing garden dirt into a museum. As I walked toward the door, I passed them, Chad and Tiffany, sitting at that expensive table in that expensive office, surrounded by all the trappings of wealth and power. And in that moment, they had never looked more powerless in their entire lives. Their father had just reached out from beyond the grave and put them in a cage, a golden cage, sure. They still had millions. They still had the house, the cars, the status, but none of it was really theirs anymore. It was all conditional, all dependent on one thing, keeping me and a 12-year-old dog happy, and there wasn't a single thing they could do about it. I took the elevator down to the lobby, walked out into the afternoon sun, the city noise at me all at once, car horns, people talking, the normal chaos of life. I pulled out my phone and looked at the address of that motel. Then I looked at the dog tag in my other hand, this small piece of metal that had just changed everything. Tomorrow, I'd be moving into a 4-bedroom guest house. Tomorrow, $350,000 would start making its way into my bank account. But right now, right this second, all I could think about was getting back to that motel room and taking Sergeant out for a proper meal. Mr. Sterling had given me power, real power, and my first order of business was to get his dog a decent dinner. Moving into the guest house took about an hour. I didn't have much. Same duffel bag I'd carried out the gates a week earlier. Some clothes, some books, a few pictures of my daughter and granddaughter. The essentials of a life lived simply. The guest house was bigger than any place I'd ever lived. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a kitchen with appliances I didn't know how to use, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over gardens I used to maintain. It felt wrong at first, like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. But Sergeant loved it immediately. He claimed a spot by the back window, where the afternoon sun came through and warmed the hardwood floor. Watching him settle in like he belonged there made it easier somehow. This wasn't about me. This was about following orders, taking care of what needed taking care of. The first morning in my new place, I woke up early. Old habits. The sun was just starting to come up, painting the sky those colors that make you remember why life is worth living. I made coffee in a machine that probably cost more than my first car, and it was the best coffee I'd ever tasted. Then I started making Sergeant's breakfast. Real filet mignon, not the cheap stuff. The kind that comes wrapped in butcher paper with the price tag that makes you wince. I seasoned it lightly, the way Mr. Sterling had shown me, and cooked it medium rare. The smell filled the entire house. Rich, savory, the kind of smell that makes your mouth water even if you just ate. I was plating it up when I happened to glance out the kitchen window. Across the courtyard, through the main house windows, I could see Chad in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter in his designer pajamas, pouring cereal from a box. Generic store-brand cereal. The kind you buy when money is tight. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was cooking steak for a dog. There he was eating discount cornflakes in his own mansion. Well, technically his mansion. Sort of. He must have smelled the steak cooking because he looked toward my house. Even from that distance, I could see the expression on his face. Rage mixed with humiliation, mixed with something that might have been hunger. He stood there for a long moment, spoon halfway to his mouth, just staring. I gave him a small wave, friendly, neighborly. He turned away from the window, so fast he almost knocked over his cereal bowl. The thing about the trust was that while they inherited everything, they couldn't actually access most of it yet. The lawyers were still working through probate. The accounts were frozen. The properties were in legal limbo. They had the house and a basic living allowance, but the real money was tied up in paperwork that would take months to untangle. Meanwhile, my salary had started hitting my account immediately. $35,000 had appeared like magic, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. Life settled into a routine, a good routine, the kind that makes you realize how much of your previous life was just grinding through the days. Mornings, I'd make Sergeant his breakfast and take him for a walk around the property that was technically theirs but felt more like mine with every passing day. We'd walk the gardens, check on the roses, make sure the fountain was working properly. Old habits from my groundskeeping days. But now I did it because I wanted to, not because I had to. Sergeant loved those morning walks. He'd move a little slower than he used to, his gray muzzle pointed into the breeze, but his tail never stopped wagging. That dog was living his best life. Around mid-morning, Tiffany would usually emerge. She'd set up by the pool with her phone and her ring light and whatever props she needed for that day's content. She would try and maintain her influencer career, but you could tell it was struggling. Her smile looked more forced each day. Her voice had that brittle quality people get when they're pretending everything is fine while their world crumbles. One particular morning, she was filming something about finding inner peace. She was sitting cross-legged on a yoga mat, doing that thing where influencers close their eyes and try to look serene while talking about mindfulness and gratitude. The kind of performance that makes you wonder if they've ever actually experienced either of those things. Right on schedule, it was time for Sergeant's playtime. I grabbed his favorite tennis ball, faded and covered in slobber and absolutely perfect in his eyes. I threw it across the lawn. He took off after with a joy that only dogs understand, barking loud enough to wake up the dead. The ball bounced right through the background of Tiffany's shot. Sergeant thundered after it, barking happily, completely oblivious of the camera or the careful staging or the fact that he was ruining everything. Tiffany's serene expression cracked. Her eye twitched, but she kept filming, kept trying to salvage it, her voice getting tighter as she talked about embracing chaos or some nonsense like that. I checked her comments later that day. Couldn't help myself. They were full of people saying how cute the dog was, how authentic it made the video feel, how they loved seeing real life instead of the usual filter perfection. Someone even said the dog had better energy than she did. She posted the video, but she looked at me differently after that, like she was starting to understand that this wasn't going to end, that this was her life now. Afternoons were my favorite. I'd make myself lunch, pour some iced tea, and sit on the back veranda with a book. Real books, the kind printed on paper. Mr. Sterling had an incredible library, and as Will had specified, I had full access to it. I'd been working my way through his collection of history books. Wars, empires, the rise and fall of civilizations. All that stuff that puts your own problems in perspective. One afternoon, I was deep into a book about ancient Rome when I heard footsteps on the gravel path. I looked up to see Chad approaching, and he had someone with him, a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather portfolio. They had that energy people get when they think they're about to close a deal. Chad's smile was so forced it probably hurt his face. He introduced his companion as an investor, someone important, someone who could see the incredible potential in the estate. He was using his business voice, the one he probably practiced in the mirror. The investor wanted to develop part of the property, turn the Eastern Gardens into a boutique hotel or some kind of luxury event space. High-end, exclusive, the kind of thing that would bring in serious money and put the estate on the map. Chad kept saying how it would increase the value of the whole property, how everyone would benefit, how I'd have an even nicer view from my window. He was selling it hard, too hard, trying to make it sound like he was doing me a favor. I let him finish his whole pitch, didn't interrupt once, just sat there, sipping my tea, listening. The investor was getting excited, probably smelling commission. Chad was getting confident, probably thinking he'd finally found a way through. When they were done, I looked over at Sergeant. He was asleep under the old magnolia tree. That tree had been there for probably 100 years. Its branches spread wide, creating this perfect circle of shade. Mr. Sterling used to sit under it with his dog on summer afternoons. I'd seen them there countless times over the years. I turned back to Chad and his investor and said sorry, but no, told him Sergeant liked that tree, that the eastern garden was his favorite place for afternoon naps. That changes to the property would disrupt his routine. The investor's face went blank. Chad's smile died. He started to argue, to negotiate, but I just picked up my book and went back to reading. They stood there for a moment, these two grown men in their expensive clothes, completely powerless in the face of one old Marine and his commitment to a dog's nap schedule. That's when I think Chad finally understood. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't business. This was something else entirely. Something he had no framework for understanding. The weeks turned into months. They tried different approaches. Tiffany attempted to befriend me, showing up with coffee and pastries, asking about my day, pretending to be interested in Sergeant's well-being. It might have worked if she'd been a better actor, but you could see the calculation behind her eyes. The way she'd steer every conversation toward the trust, the property, the possibilities. Chad went the respect route. Started calling me sir. Asked about my time in the Marines. Showed what he probably thought was genuine interest in my life. But it was all performance. All strategy. These people didn't know how to have a real conversation. They only knew transactions. I was polite. Always polite. But I never gave them what they wanted. Not because I was trying to torture them, though I won't lie and say there wasn't some satisfaction in it. I didn't give them what they wanted because my job was to take care of Sergeant, and anything that didn't serve that mission was irrelevant. The turning point came about 4 months in. It was late afternoon, and I was in the garden with Sergeant. He was exploring the roses, sniffing each one carefully, taking his time the way old dogs do. The sun was starting to set, turning everything golden. I heard running footsteps. Looked up to see Tiffany coming toward me. Her makeup was smeared. Her perfect hair was messy. She wasn't filming, wasn't performing. This was something real finally breaking through all those carefully constructed layers. She stopped a few feet away from me, breathing hard. Started yelling about how I was enjoying this, how I was destroying their lives, how I was a cruel old man who got off on their suffering. Her voice was shaking, getting louder. All that influencer polish stripped away, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. I stood up slowly, looked at her, really looked at her, not as the enemy, not as a spoiled kid who'd insulted me and threatened Sergeant, just as another human being who was suffering, even if she brought it on herself. I told her I was a United States Marine Corps veteran, that I'd been given orders, that her father had trusted me with a mission, that I was going to complete that mission, because that's what you do when someone puts their faith in you. I said maybe if she tried doing the same thing once in her life, she'd understand, but I doubted it. My voice wasn't angry, wasn't mocking, just stating facts, simple truths that she'd probably never heard before. She stood there, tears running down her face, making these choking sounds that might have been sobs or might have been rage. She looked like she wanted to say something else, but no words came. Just that helpless fury of someone who finally realized they can't buy, charm, or manipulate their way out of the consequences of their choices. After a long moment, she turned and walked away, not running anymore, just walking, defeated. I sat back down. Sergeant came over and put his head on my knee, the way dogs do when they sense you need comfort, even if you didn't know it yourself. People talk about revenge like it's this hot, active thing, like you have to plot and scheme and hurt people back for what they did to you. But I learned something in those months. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's just doing your job, being good at what you do, living well, letting other people destroy themselves with their own poison while you focus on what actually matters. There's a saying that resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I'd heard it before, but never really understood it until I watched Chad and Tiffany eat themselves alive with anger while I just kept taking care of a dog and enjoying my life. 6 months in, they stopped trying to be friendly. The masks came off completely. Chad would glare at me when we crossed paths. Tiffany stopped even acknowledging my existence. They'd hole up in the main house, visible through windows like actors in play, moving through rooms full of expensive things they couldn't really enjoy. I'd see them sometimes, late at night, sitting in that massive living room with all its art and antiques. Just sitting there, staring at nothing, prisoners in a golden cage they'd inherited. The irony was beautiful in its own dark way. They'd spent their whole lives wanting their father's money, dreaming about the day they'd inherit his empire, and they got it. They got everything they wanted. The house, the accounts, the status. But it was all conditional, all dependent on one thing: keeping me happy, keeping Sergeant healthy and content. As long as I said no, they couldn't touch the real value of what they'd inherited, couldn't sell it, couldn't leverage it, couldn't do anything with it except live in it and watch me enjoy myself. Their lawyers tried everything, challenged the trust from every angle they could think of, but Mr. Sterling had been thorough. He'd spent the last year of his life making this bulletproof, and he'd succeeded. Every legal challenge hit a wall. Every argument got shut down. Wyoming trust law is specifically designed for this kind of thing, to protect the wishes of the person who created it. And Mr. Sterling's wishes were crystal clear. I'd read the full trust document by then. Davis had provided me with a copy. The language was beautiful in its precision. Every possible loophole closed. Every potential challenge anticipated. There was one section that stuck with me. It was near the end, after all the legal language and conditions. A personal note that Mr. Sterling had insisted be included. It explained why he'd done this. Not for the lawyers or the courts. For Chad and Tiffany, though they'd probably never read it. He wrote about how he'd failed them as a father, how he'd given them everything except what they actually needed: discipline, purpose, real love. How he'd watched them become the kind of people who threatened to hurt a dog just to spite a loyal employee. How he couldn't stop being their father, but he could at least try to teach them one final lesson. That lesson was simple. You don't own anything in this life. You're just borrowing it. And if you can't appreciate what you have, you'll lose it to someone who can. I thought about that a lot during my morning walks with Sargent, about ownership and stewardship, about the difference between having things and taking care of things. Chad and Tiffany own an estate worth hundreds of millions, but they couldn't take care of it, couldn't appreciate it, could barely stand to live in it because every day was a reminder of their powerlessness. I owned nothing, not the house I lived in, not the car I drove, not even the dog I cared for, but I took care of all of it, protected it, appreciated it, and somehow that made me richer than they'd ever be. About 8 months in, I was sitting on my veranda when I saw something that made me stop. Chad was in the main house, visible through the massive windows. He was standing in front of one of the paintings, a Monet worth millions, just standing there, staring at it. From that distance, I couldn't see his expression clearly, but something about his posture looked different, less angry, more tired. Like maybe, finally, he was starting to understand. Or maybe I was giving him too much credit. Maybe he was just calculating its value, figuring out how much of his inheritance was tied up in that one piece of canvas. I'd probably never know. And honestly, it didn't matter. My job wasn't to fix them, wasn't to teach them lessons, wasn't to make them better people. My job was simple: take care of Sargent, follow my orders, honor the trust a dying man placed in me. Everything else was just noise. A year had passed since Mr. Sterling died. Since that day, I walked through the gates with nothing but a duffel bag and a dog that wasn't mine. Since the moment I thought my life was over. Now I was sitting on a perfectly manicured lawn, sun warm in my face, watching Sargent gnaw on his favorite toy, that ridiculous rubber duck that squeaked when he bit it. He'd been working on destroying that thing for months, and he was getting close. The estate spread out around us. Acres of green, pools and gardens and walking paths. The main house loomed in the background, all glass and stone, and expensive architecture. Beautiful, impressive, empty. I could see movement in the windows sometimes. Chad and Tiffany, going through their days, living in luxury, trapped in paradise. They thought they owned the world. thought money and inheritance made them powerful. But they never understood that some things can't be bought. Loyalty, honor, the love of an old dog, trust earned over years of showing up and doing the work. Sergeant dropped his toy and nudged my hand with his wet nose. Wanted attention, wanted his ears scratched. I obliged, and he made that satisfied grumbling sound dogs make when you hit the perfect spot. In that moment, scratching a dog's ears while the sun set over a garden I used to maintain, I understood something important. This wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about revenge or justice or proving anything to anyone. This was about keeping a promise, following orders, being the kind of person who, when trusted with something important, doesn't let that trust down. Mr. Sterling had given me a mission, not because I was special, not because I was clever, but because he knew I'd do exactly what I said I'd do, no matter what. And I would. Sometimes at night, before falling asleep, I'd think about that day in his bedroom, the smell of medicine and old books, the weight of the dog tag in my palm, his whispered orders, the understanding between two old soldiers. He'd known what his kids would do, known they'd kick me out, known they'd threaten Sergeant. He'd seen it all coming, and he'd planned accordingly, not to punish them, though it probably felt like punishment, but to protect what mattered, to make sure his dog would be safe, to give me the tools I needed to complete the mission. That's what leadership looks like. That's what real power is. Not control, not money, not ownership, but the ability to protect what needs protecting, even after you're gone. There's a saying about anger being like acid, how it eats away at the container, holding it more than anything else. I'd watched that happen in real time. Watched Chad and Tiffany poison themselves with resentment while I just kept doing my job, kept following orders, kept taking care of an old dog who deserved better than what he would have gotten from them. They were drowning in their own bitterness, suffocating in their golden prison. And me, I was just doing my job, following my orders. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply being good at what you do. That could have been the end of it. That quiet routine stretching out forever. Me and Sergeant, living our simple life in the guest house. Them trapped in their mansion, unable to move forward or let go. But people like Chad and Tiffany don't accept defeat easily. They tried friendship, tried respect, tried legal challenges. All of it had failed. So they went back to what they understood best. Money. It was about 14 months after Mr. Sterling died. Early evening. I was on the veranda reading when I saw them coming across the lawn together. That was unusual. They rarely coordinated anymore. Mostly avoided each other, like two prisoners who'd given up on escape and now just endured their separate cells. But here they were, walking side by side, united by something. Chad was carrying a leather folder, the expensive kind. Their faces had that look people get when they're about to make what they think is a final offer. They stopped at the bottom of my steps. Didn't ask to come up. Maybe they'd learned that much at least. Chad opened the folder and pulled out a piece of paper. Heavy stock, official looking. He held it so I could see it. A bank check, made out to me. The amount made my breath catch for just a second. $10 million. He let me look at it for a moment before he spoke. Said it was mine. Right now. Today. All I had to do was sign a document, releasing my guardianship of Sergeant. I could take the dog with me if I wanted. Go anywhere. Do anything. $10 million buys a lot of freedom. Tiffany added that they'd even throw in the Rolls Royce, the one Sergeant used for his appointments. Said I deserved it. Said I'd done a good job, and this was their way of saying thank you. Her voice had that practiced sincerity that influencers use when they're selling something. I looked at that check. Really looked at it. $10 million. More money than I'd make in a dozen lifetimes. More than I'd ever dreamed of having. Enough to set up my daughter and granddaughter for life. Enough to never worry about anything again. I could picture it. A house somewhere quiet. Maybe Montana or Wyoming. Some land. Peace. Taking Sergeant with me. Giving him the same good life somewhere nobody knew our history. It would be easy. So easy. Sign one paper. Take the check. walk away from all of this. For maybe 10 seconds, I considered it. Then Sergeant, who'd been dozing at my feet, lifted his head. He'd heard them approach. He looked at Chad and Tiffany, and his tail didn't wag. Just watched them with those old, wise eyes. Then he looked at me, trusting, waiting. I reached down and took the check from Chad's hand. He smiled. Tiffany smiled. They thought they'd won. Thought they'd finally found my price. I looked at the numbers one more time. All those zeros. A lifetime of security. Freedom from worry. Everything most people dream about. Then I tore it in half. The sound was surprisingly loud in the quiet evening. Just paper ripping, but it seemed to echo. I tore it again, and again, until it was just confetti in my hands. Chad's smile died so fast you'd think someone had flipped a switch. Tiffany made this small gasping sound, like I just slapped her. I let the pieces fall. They drifted down, catching the evening light, landing on the deck like snow. When I spoke, my voice was quiet. Calm, not angry, not triumphant, just stating simple facts. I told them their father had entrusted me with something they'd never understand, something that couldn't be measured in dollars or bought with checks or valued on a spreadsheet. He'd given me a mission, and I was going to complete it, not for money, not for revenge, not for satisfaction, because that's what you do when someone trusts you with something that matters. I said if they didn't have anything else, Sergeant needed his evening walk. They stood there, frozen. Tiffany was crying again, but differently this time. Not angry tears. Defeated tears. The kind you cry when you finally realize you've lost something and there's no getting it back. Chad picked up one of the torn pieces of the check. Stared at it like he couldn't believe what had just happened. Like his entire understanding of the world had just been proven wrong. Then they left. Walked back to the main house in silence, their shoulders slumped, their steps heavy, looking older than they had any right to look at their age. I sat there for a while after they were gone, Sergeant's head on my knee, the pieces of that check scattered around my feet like evidence of something, evidence that some things still can't be bought, that some promises still mean something, that somewhere in this world there are still people who understand the difference between price and value. After a bit, I stood up, brushed the paper confetti off my lap. It would blow away, or I'd sweep it up tomorrow. Didn't matter. Sergeant was already at the door, tail wagging, ready for his walk. That dog had his priorities straight. The next morning, they were gone. Not permanently, just for the weekend. I saw their cars pull out of the driveway, running away for a few days, trying to figure out their next move, or maybe just try to escape the constant reminder of their powerlessness. Life went on. The routine continued, and I was grateful for it. Grateful for the simplicity. Grateful for the purpose. Time passed the way it does when you're content. Days blending together not because they're boring, but because they're good. Because you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and there's a peace in that. Another year went by, then part of another. I'm sitting on the lawn now, on a perfect afternoon. The kind of day that makes you grateful to be alive. Sergeant is next to me, gnawing on his favorite toy, a rubber duck that squeaks when he bites it just right. He's been working on destroying that thing for months. It's holding up better than you'd expect. The sun is warm on my face. There's a light breeze carrying the smell of the roses from the garden. Somewhere in the distance, I can hear birds. The fountain running. Life happening the way it's supposed to. The estate spreads out around us. All that manicured perfection. The house standing massive and impressive in the background. Its windows reflecting the afternoon light. Beautiful architecture. Beautiful landscaping. Beautiful everything. And completely empty where it counts. I can see them sometimes, through those big windows. Chad and Tiffany, moving through the rooms like ghosts, sitting on expensive furniture, surrounded by expensive art, living in the kind of luxury most people can only dream about, and absolutely miserable. They thought they owned the world, thought their father's money made them powerful, thought inheritance meant control. But they never understood the most basic truth. You can't buy the things that actually matter, can't purchase loyalty or honor or love, can't inherit character or earn trust with a signature on a check. Mr. Sterling had tried to teach them that their whole lives. They never listened. So he taught them one last time in a way they couldn't ignore, gave them everything they wanted, made them rich beyond imagination, then showed them that none of it meant anything without the things you can't buy. Sergeant drops his toy and nudges my hand, wants his ears scratched. I oblige, hitting that spot behind his left ear that makes his back leg kick. He makes a happy grumbling sound that dogs make when life is exactly as it should be. Sergeant rolls onto his back, asking for belly rubs. His gray fur is warm from the sun. His tail wags in lazy circles. He's completely, perfectly happy. That right there is the whole mission. I used to think this was about revenge, but it's not. There's a saying that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I've watched Chad and Tiffany drink that poison every day for 2 years, drowning in a golden prison of their own making. And me? I just kept my word. I learned a long time ago the best revenge isn't some grand plan. It's just simple, stubborn human decency. For people like them, there's nothing in the world more infuriating. The sun is starting to set now, painting everything in gold and orange and that particular kind of light that makes ordinary moments feel sacred. The estate glows. The windows of the main house catch fire with the reflection. It's beautiful, truly beautiful. And somewhere inside that beautiful prison, two people who have everything are slowly realizing they have nothing. While out here on this lawn, an old man and an old dog have nothing and somehow have everything. Tomorrow will be the same. And the day after that, and the day after that, more walks, more meals, more quiet moments of peace, more simple acts of care for a creature that deserves it. And through it all, through every single day, I'll carry that dog tag in my pocket, the one Mr. Sterling pressed into my palm with his dying breath, the one that turned out to be a key to a kingdom, a weapon disguised as a memorial, a final order from one Marine to another. Take care of Sergeant. Don't let them hurt him. Mission accomplished, sir. Mission continues. Mission never ends. Semper Fi.